October 6, 1973. At precisely 2 p.m., as Yom Kippur prayers filled synagogues across Israel, 2,000 Egyptian guns unleashed a synchronized wall of fire across the Suez Canal. In under 20 minutes, one of the world's most fortified defense lines, Israel's Bar Lev Line, was engulfed. The Bar Lev Line had been Israel's strategic guarantee since 1968. 31 bunkers connected by sand embankments up to 25 meters high, reinforced with reinforced concrete and monitored by elite forward observers. According to Israeli intelligence, any breach attempt would need 24 to 48 hours of sustained artillery and bridge laying, time they believed impossible under Egyptian capabilities. But Cairo had prepared something else entirely. The crossing was just one part of a broader decision orchestrated by President Anwar Sadat: either wait for Syria to fully mobilize in the Golan or strike now, on the holiest day in the Israeli calendar. Sadat chose audacity. The outcome: over 80,000 Egyptian troops crossed in just 18 hours. Rather than frontal demolition or high explosives, Egyptian engineers used high-pressure water cannons pumped from the canal itself to dissolve the sand ramparts. In just 3 hours, 60 gaps were opened. Tanks began to flow across hastily assembled Soviet PMP bridges behind an uninterrupted artillery barrage. Zooming into a single crossing point, we find the 16th Infantry Division, one of 5 Egyptian divisions tasked with opening the corridor. Their engineers raced against the Israeli Air Force, knowing any delay would trigger counterstrikes. But Israeli armor and aircraft were late. The SAM-6 missile umbrella, deployed days before but masked under withdrawal maneuvers, neutralized air support for most of the first 24 hours. Israel's line of reaction, supposed to mobilize within hours, was nowhere to be found. Most reserves were still fasting with their families when the first Egyptian troops were already planting flags on the eastern bank. What was the Egyptian dilemma? Strike in tandem with Syria to split Israel's attention, or gamble that Israeli intelligence would dismiss solo movement as a drill? The choice to strike alone and now paid off because the deception had worked. Repeated fake mobilizations in preceding months had numbed Israeli alert levels. How could bulldozers and water pumps, deployed in silence, shatter the myth of Israel's strongest defense in just 3 hours? If you're enjoying this deep dive into one of the most unexpected military turnarounds in history, don't forget to subscribe for more war strategy breakdowns. On September 27, 1973, 9 days before the war, satellite images and Israeli scouts observed massive Egyptian troop movements toward the Suez Canal. Alarm bells rang across Israeli intelligence units. But just 3 days later, the entire Egyptian formation appeared to pull back. The Israeli High Command breathed easier. Amman, the military intelligence directorate, had seen this pattern before. Training exercise, routine redeployment, same as in May and August. Even when Egypt surged to 80,000 troops near the canal by October 3rd, most analysts flagged it as bluff. That was precisely the trap Sadat had set. After months of cry-wolf drills, Israel's intelligence community began treating real data like noise. This was not a technical failure, but a cognitive one. Fatigue muted response, and the cost was catastrophic. Behind closed doors, Sadat faced a dilemma. Should he keep the final offensive plan restricted to a tight circle, even at the cost of coordination delays, or share widely and risk Israeli detection? He opted for silence. Only a handful of generals knew the crossing would be real. Egyptian media continued to downplay tensions. Logistics trains carrying bridges and water cannons were labeled training deer. Even units posted to Sinai received sealed orders just hours before 0 hour. This deception operation, codenamed Badr, relied on a simple premise. Israel had grown addicted to its own narrative. Sadat didn't need stealth, just predictable Israeli confidence. By the morning of October 6th, idea for reserve divisions were still unmobilized. When the shelling began, Israel had fewer than 500 troops on duty along the entire canal front. Had Egypt shared operational timing with Syria earlier, a broader two-front blitz could have been launched. But that might have leaked to Israeli signals units. Sadat chose surprise over scale, and it worked. If that level of deception surprised you, hit the like button. It really helps us reach more history enthusiasts like you. Because Sadat withdrew his armies just long enough, Israel stood down its defenses, granting Egypt not just the initiative, but the first uncontested hours of the war. In most military doctrines, the idea of attacking a wide front seems intuitive. More ground, more confusion, more chances to break through. But Sadat's command did the opposite. From the outset of Operation Badr, Egypt focused 5 infantry divisions on a single 15-kilometer stretch of the canal, aiming for just a few breach points, even though the canal spanned 160 kilometers. This was no logistical accident. It was a calculated decision made during late-stage war games in Cairo. Egyptian planners knew their SAM umbrella could only reach 10 to 12 kilometers beyond the canal. Pushing further would mean entering Israeli air superiority zones, a death sentence without Soviet air cover. Command Post October 5. In a bunker outside Ismailia, General Shazley argued, "If we spread out, we die out. Focus, hold, and dare them to hit us." This tactical compression was not cowardice. It was the only way to survive long enough to matter. Concentrating force allowed Egypt to double down on engineering, artillery, and bridging in a single sector, instead of thinning assets across a broad front. This let them cross quickly, reinforce within hours, and hold ground without immediate armor support. Why not go for the full Sinai then? That question was asked repeatedly by Egyptian corps commanders. The answer was brutal. Even if a deeper push succeeded, the air cover wouldn't follow. Tanks would outrun the SAM shield, and Egypt couldn't afford a repeat of 1967. In practice, this meant a front-loaded gamble. Seize a small bridgehead and trench fast and turn it into a negotiation chip. This narrowed objective also forced Israel into a psychological corner. The limited scope confused Israeli intelligence, who couldn't decide whether it was a full invasion or a demonstration. That delay in judgment was enough to hold the canal crossings for 24 hours uncontested. By concentrating its power into a 15-kilometer storm, Egypt turned a limited assault into a lasting geopolitical message. Sometimes holding one bridgehead matters more than chasing 5. What do you think? Was this focused strategy Egypt's smartest move of the war? Let me know in the comments below. On the afternoon of October 6th, as Egyptian troops surged across the Suez Canal, the roads of southern Israel remained eerily still. Reserve divisions, Israel's true strategic core, were still at home. Many officers were at synagogue, others unreachable. Israel's active duty presence along the canal had just 436 soldiers in defensive positions across the entire Bar Lev Line. The first organized Israeli counterstrike would take nearly 12 hours and arrived piecemeal. This wasn't a failure of men, it was a failure of structure. The Israeli doctrine had always rested on rapid reserve activation, but no formal mobilization order had been issued before the first shells fell. The fear, premature action could be seen as an act of war. Negev, early afternoon. Lieutenant David Yaniv was home with his children. His call-up notice came via a neighbor who'd heard it on the radio. By the time he reached his base, most tanks lacked updated maps. The Israeli cabinet had debated mobilization for days, but delayed. Intelligence said the odds of war were low, but rising. But without firm proof, Prime Minister Golda Meir and Defense Minister Moshe Dayan hesitated. Their worst fear, launching reserves early and being blamed for starting the war. The idea faced a tactical dilemma: scramble under fire and risk chaos, or wait until intentions were confirmed, then react. In choosing the latter, Israel effectively forfeited the first 12 hours of battlefield initiative. What followed was a scrambled, theater-wide improvisation. Brigades were assembled on the move. Artillery crews arrived with no shells. Some tank units had to borrow fuel from civilian trucks. At Chinese Farm and beyond, battalion leaders were committing armor to battle with less than one full map of enemy positions. The Israeli response was not just delayed, it was fragmented. Reserve formations arrived in staggered waves, each facing a canal already crossed, defenses already overrun, and an enemy entrenched. If the Israeli doctrine relied on rapid reserves, how could it collapse from a single missed signal?
While the Suez Canal flared to the south, the Golan Heights cracked to the north. On dawn on October 6th, 5 full Syrian divisions began rolling over the Golan's eastern slopes. In just 6 hours, they had penetrated up to 10 kilometers, pushing Israeli defenses to the brink. On paper, 1,400 Syrian tanks faced only 177 Israeli defenders. The terrain was Israel's only ally. Tight valleys, open killing zones, and elevation lines that forced Syrian armor to bunch together. But the imbalance was staggering. The backbone of Israel's defense was the Barak Brigade, stationed across the Golan with incomplete maps and half-trained reinforcement. Colonel Yitzhak Ben Shoham, who commanded the southern sector, died within the first 48 hours. His last orders? Delay. Buy time. Don't die in vain. Tank commander Zvi Greengold, fresh from reserves and alone, took to the battlefield without a full crew. By midnight, he destroyed over a dozen Syrian tanks by bluffing radio calls to suggest multiple units were present. Israel's defense relied on using narrow passes as bottlenecks, forcing Syrians into predictable kill zones, but the gamble was that reserves would arrive before the high ground fell. They didn't. Strategically, Syria had opted for a multi-axis advance, hoping to overwhelm thin Israeli lines quickly and push toward the Jordan Valley. But the deliberate Syrian decision to bypass full air cover meant their flanks were vulnerable. Israel, despite the odds, used this. Tank crews fought in rotating pairs, one firing, one reloading, trading ground for hours of delay. By October 8th, the entire northern front, held by 3 battalions, half their vehicles lost, but Syrian advance stalled. Because 177 tanks delayed 1,400 for 2 days, Israel bought the time it needed for air power and reserves to turn a collapse into a counteroffensive.
If you admire how 177 tanks held off 1,400, give this video a thumbs up. That story deserves it.
By October 9th, the Israeli military was on the brink. On both fronts, tank losses exceeded 500. Ammunition was low. Spare parts for American-made aircraft were running out. Without resupply, the IDF's counterattack options would collapse within days. That's when the airlift began. The decision wasn't immediate. In Washington, President Richard Nixon faced two risks: either let Israel alter, damaging U.S. credibility and alliance trust, or intervene massively, risking Soviet retaliation and broader Cold War escalation. After consulting with Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, Nixon gave the green light: send everything that can fly. Between October 14th and November 14th, over 22,000 tons of materiel arrived via Operation Nickelgrass, a non-stop American air bridge. On October 12th, a heated conversation unfolded between Kissinger and Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin. The USSR had begun its own resupply flights to Egypt and Syria. Both superpowers were now fueling a regional war without ever declaring one. An F-4 Phantom jet consumes parts at a scale no nation can stockpile during war. Israel, surrounded by adversaries, had no strategic depth. Logistics had to arrive mid-fight. Cargo jets were landing at Ben Gurion Airport every 90 minutes, sometimes under blackout conditions. Should Israel delay counterattacks until fully resupplied, or strike while Egyptian forces were still stretched thin? Diane pushed for delay. Elazar, the chief of staff, argued for immediate maneuver. The compromise: strike with what's available, but rely on U.S. airlift to sustain pressure. In the south, this materialized as Sharon's countercrossing at the Chinese farm. In the north, it meant surge armor to the Golan, tanks fresh from American cargo planes. Because the U.S. intervened not with troops, but with fuel, shells, and airframes, it shifted the war's trajectory, proving that logistics can redraw battlefield maps without a single soldier landing. On the evening of October 8th, President Anwar Sadat gathered his top commanders in Cairo. By then, Egyptian troops had secured bridgeheads east of the Suez Canal, inflicting damage and holding under Israeli counterpressure. What he said was not a victory speech, it was a directive. We've proven Israel can bleed. Now make sure the world knows we bled with purpose. Sadat's war was never about reaching Tel Aviv. From the beginning, his strategic doctrine focused on limited objectives: seize just enough territory to shatter the myth of Israeli invincibility, force a political negotiation, and restore Arab dignity after 1967. His generals, riding high after early victories, wanted more, push deeper, target supply lines. But Sadat refused. "This war is for position, not annihilation," he repeated, as field commanders pressed for more aggressive posturing. Arab armies had not only lost wars, but the belief they could win them. Sadat's gamble was to recalibrate expectations. Victory was not in maps, but in message. Holding Israeli troops east of the canal, even temporarily, reprogrammed Arab morale. Should Egypt turn tactical success into a broader push, risking overextension and air vulnerability, or freeze lines and declare strategic success? Sadat chose the latter. He used bridgeheads as bargaining chips. Within weeks, UN Resolution 338 was tabled. Ceasefire lines were drawn. Egypt had re-entered the political arena, not as a defeated client state, but as a force to be reckoned with. Strategically, this changed the regional calculus. Arab capitals no longer viewed war solely as suicide, and in Tel Aviv,
planners were now forced to accept that regional deterrence was no longer absolute. If victory lies in perception, was Sadat the only general in 1973 who truly won? What's your take? Did Sadat clearly win the war through strategy rather than territory? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories of history's turning points.